The numbers are in, and in case you were on vacation last week like me, data collected by the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration show that the world is hotter than ever. In fact, June was the warmest month on record. Land temperatures across the globe measured almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit above the 20th century average. And as you might imagine, the findings are fueling the debate over climate change. Here to separate fact from fiction and tell us what the data really mean is Seb Henbest. He is an analyst and climate specialist at Bloomberg's New Energy Finance. Seb joins us this morning from Sydney, Australia, where, of course, it is no longer morning. Seb, should the NOAA data silence the skeptics? Do these numbers show unequivocally that climate change is real?
I think what the NOAA data shows is that the evidence for climate change is really crystallised at this point in time, and there really is a mountain of it which suggests that the climate is warming. And as you mentioned, June was the warmest June on record, and if we go back to March, to April, and also as May as well, was the warmest months of those on record for 2010. And 2010 is looking like it's going to be the warmest year on record as well. So that the NOAA data is really important because it really does take a snapshot of our current understanding of the trend of warming across the globe for a number of indicators. We're talking about atmospheric temperature on land, on ocean heat content. We're talking about glacial extent. We're talking about snow coverage. And all these indicators point in one direction, and that is that the globe is warming.
Seb, what about the question of man's role? You know, some people say that all of this heat is just the product of a warming trend that is taking place naturally. Right. Well, there are all sorts of skeptical positions about the evidence of climate change. There are those who accept the fact that the climate is warming, but at the same time say that man is not responsible. What we see in the science is a whole team of scientific specialists whose job it is to find out whether that statement is true or not, and to determine whether man is responsible for the changing climate that we see, that attribution effect. The simple answer to that is that there are a number of indicators which show very, very clearly that what we're looking at is warming from radiative gas forcing, not from the sun, not from volcanoes, not from other natural effects, but from the influx of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And that connection is really quite strong. Okay, so ignoring the debates for the moment over who's responsible, Seb, what is it going to mean at the end of the day? The public, as you know, is increasingly dubious of the climate change debate. The U.S. Senate, as we all know now, abandoned cap and trade efforts. Copenhagen was a bust. What's going to happen? Who's going to do something about this? Well, it's a very good question. There is a lot of action globally. The Europeans are debating whether to move from a 20% to a 30% unilateral emission reduction target. New Zealand has just started an emissions trading scheme to help reduce its emissions. In other parts of the world, there is a bit of an impasse, in the US particularly, also down here in Australia. And it's a very difficult time, I think, for legislation in this direction. We saw Copenhagen, as you said, produced a less than optimal result. We've had the coldest winter for 30 years in Britain, Snowmageddon in the US. I mean, these are isolated events, and overall, the last winter in the Northern Hemisphere was anomalously warm when you look at the global average. But when you add all these things together and put the recession on top of that, it's very difficult for policymakers at the moment. But what the science really shows us is that the issue of climate change is not going to go away, and that whether it takes a couple of years to get the ducks in a row and get the legislation in place to make deeper cuts in emissions over time, our analysis suggests that the science is robust. And therefore, it is only a matter of time before governments move in that direction much more strongly, particularly in the United States and Australia. Okay, but until those governments actually do move forward, and this is a key question for the investment community, does business effectively get a reprieve? Yes and no. The difficulty is that the business community expects legislation to limit carbon emissions, whether it be a cap and trade scheme or a carbon tax. And as a result, we find that investment, particularly in energy infrastructure, is really hamstrung. People can't invest in carbon-intensive infrastructure in case a carbon price is put into the system in the short term. And they also can't really invest in cleaner infrastructure like natural gas or some renewables because, for the same reason, they're not as competitive as coal-fired power, for example. So in the absence of policy, we can get a complete stagnation of investment, and it makes it very difficult for people to put their money in the right places.
Seb, I'm afraid we have to leave it there, but thank you very much for joining us. Seb Henbest, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, with us from Sydney.